Okay, well, welcome to week 7. No, week 6. Gosh, getting ahead of myself. But the semester has gone quickly, hasn't it? Very quickly. So it's a halfway point of the course, so congratulations on getting here. I hope you've enjoyed it. Certainly, and just to say again, we did mark those discussions over the last couple of weeks and we were absolutely thrilled with the quality of your responses. It was just fantastic. And that goes for all three of us. Terry's not marking the discussions as such, but he was in there having a look around and we were very impressed overall. So congratulations for that. As promised, I'm going to give just a couple of minutes on the assessment that's due after the break. So the one that's due on Friday, the 20th of April. So you'll have the break and then there's that week 7 and then it's at the end of week 7. And just remember as well that there is a, is it a quiz or a discussion board due at the same time. So just have that on your mind as well. I'm only going to be very brief here because the instructions themselves are quite detailed. But as always, for those in class, if you want to ask a question during the break or after class, that's fine. And anyone online or in class, for that matter, who wants to ask a question, just feel free to email. We'll be out of the office quite a bit over the next couple of weeks, but I certainly will be able to answer emails fairly quickly, so that's the best way to get in touch rather than calling. So anyway, this is a literature review, and the reason for this kind of a task is that we want to get you to start thinking not just about the content you're engaging with, so obviously you're doing these readings, but we want to get you to start thinking critically about the readings themselves. Okay, so engaging with them in a critical way. So that's really what this task is about. Okay, so what we'd encourage you to do for it, and this is just going by the instructions there, is choose a reading from the last 6 weeks. One of the optional ones, so not the course study guide, okay, so it's one of those additional readings that you choose. The best advice would be to choose one that you found most enjoyable to engage with, so one that you didn't find you were struggling through and all that kind of thing, something that you found interesting because that will be the one that you feel most comfortable writing about. When you have a look, and this is on page 13 of the course outline, when you have a look at the instructions there, you'll see a 5-step plan. Now that's actually what's called a scaffold for your assignment. Okay, so if you follow that carefully, it tells you exactly what you need to do and the amount of words that you need to do it in. So in a sense, we've provided you with the plan for your literature review. We haven't provided you with the missing pieces, what to put in there, that's your job, but this is the plan you should go by. In terms of the words there, that's a rough guide. You don't need to get that perfectly right. We certainly won't be counting them in that sense. Oh, Terry is going to be counting them. Okay. Well, there, you better watch out because he's marking them. So, when you have a look through those instructions, you'll notice that there are certain words which are highlighted in bold and they're defined below. These are the verbs. These are the things that we want to see you doing in your assessment. One of them is to describe, one of them is to examine, and one of them is to evaluate. So what I'd encourage you to do is read those definitions carefully, know what we're looking for you to do in the assignment, and then do that, because that's exactly what we'll be marking you by. Over the page, there's the marking rubric, as there is for every assessment in this course. Get to know that well. You'll note that it's very similar to the discussion board marking rubric. So you'll already know what kind of things we're looking for, although this is a different kind of assessment, so you know those criteria will be used in the specific fashion concerned with this assessment. The last thing to note is that everyone will be submitting via Turnitin. That will be available online as soon as possible, because and some of you, I know that this is your first course at university, one of the things the university likes to do is make the Turnitin facility available for you a bit before the assignment's due, so you can actually do a practice submit, which means you can submit it, have a look through it, make sure you've referenced correctly and all that kind of thing, and then if you need to make any changes, make the changes and submit it again. Okay, so I'll make that available as soon as humanly possible, and there'll be an announcement go out when that happens. So any further questions, please direct them to me by email or in person afterwards. The word limit is important, so try and stick to that. It's not huge. Do try and stick to it, and make sure you stick on topic too. The biggest problem, and it doesn't matter if you're an undergraduate, a postgraduate, or a doctoral student, is staying on topic. So just make sure you keep focused in your submissions. Okay, and as I said, Terry will be marking these, and I don't think there's anything else you need to add, is there, on top of that? So good luck with it, and we'll look forward to hearing about it.
Okay, well, welcome to a 1,000-year romp. There's probably at least, 37 different ways one could approach trying to get to this stuff in an hour and a half or so. And what I'm going to try and do is do it kind of by themes rather than chronologically, because I don't think chronologically quite captures it. There's all sorts of stuff happening on the sides that is relevant. And it'll probably at times look a little bit like one of those movies, where you don't quite know which era you're supposed to be in. I'll try and make it like the old days when you used to get those sort of swimming, kind of watery features where the picture kind of went all funny and then you knew that, it was going back. Rather than get too kind of ultra-modern. The focus is on this really the most fundamental of the splits that ever happened in Christianity, really. It was the unthinkable when East and West kind of went their own way. I mean, for most of us in the West, it probably doesn't seem to have had quite the same impact as the later split between Protestantism and Catholicism, a few centuries on, basically the splitting of the Western Church, if you like. Clearly more significant for most of us. But at the time, and looking back on it, in many ways this was the really big one. And if this hadn't happened, quite likely the other one wouldn't have happened, or certainly wouldn't have happened in the way that it did. I mean, for one thing, it gave a whole lot of people in the West Goldman, you should know better. Have a word with him. The focus is on the East and Western Schism. That happens in 1054, so it's right at the heights of the Middle Ages. And these two larger-than-life characters, Augustine and Aquinas, kind of like the bookends to this event. There's no real explaining theologically what happened here without Augustine, who we Mike touched on last week. And in many ways, what Aquinas is left with is the mess to try and clean up. Part of his work is defined by trying to find, some sort of middle ground between East and West. This is like the 1200s, and he agonises over that split and tries to find the fine point theologically that might ultimately bring them back together again. Okay, so this was a long time coming, and we started to get some sense of it probably from what we've done in the last few weeks. I want to look at the councils again, pull some of those up again, but this time look at them not just from the Christological debate point of view, but also the politics that was going on behind, and that's inextricable. In many ways, the Christological stuff was just the respectable front for what were often fairly blatant political events. None more so than Nicaea, that really established the Greco-Roman and particularly an increasingly Roman dominance over Christianity, where that had not been the dominant form of Christianity at all. And as we saw, it delivered to us the Nicene Creed that people still utter, you know, when they go to church. And the big job that the big result that it delivered was an assurance of Jesus' full divinity. I put in brackets there, you know, an anti-Arian creed. I think it could as well and maybe even more accurately be described as the anti-Arian creed, because that's what it was really all about. And so that's why you get some of that odd wording in it, you know. Begotten, not made. No, not like Arius said. Not made. I mean, it's pretty strange language in a creed to have negative like that, you know. Not made. Not made. You know, what's that mean? It means, you know, not what Arius said. Not what Arius said. Oh, so it's not made. So what is it? Begotten. Oh, of course, begotten. We all know what that means. And I gather from my linguist friends that in English it's about as good as it gets. By the time you get to Japanese, it's getting really, really abstruse. Begotten, not made. Some funny stuff going on there. That, again, you know, one of these days, one can only hope, we'll go back and honestly have another look at, get it a bit straighter. But what was going on all the time was really this Roman domination thing. And so the other big thing that Nicaea does, quite blatantly, and towards the end apparently, was just kind of slip in. Everyone's getting a bit tired, and probably a lot of these Eastern bishops realised finally they've been done over. The prominence of Rome over Alexandria, which was the centre for most of them. So, you know, if anybody tries to say, as I've heard said, oh, yeah, the Roman emperor was there sitting in the chair, but, you know, he didn't influence events. Really, he was just there to, you know, protect the bishops, you know, the way Adolf Hitler might have been chairing a conference, you know, of German Council of Churches in 1938 or something, you know, sitting in there saying, yeah, don't worry about me, you know, just you have your theological debate, you know, I'll just sit here and take it in. Sure. The fact that these largely Eastern bishops voted to do in their own church in favour of a church that probably, frankly, a lot of them had never been to, that they would have known, felt, brackets, known, they were intellectually superior to, they had a superior form of Christianity. It was this Eastern Arabic Christianity at the time that had the scholarship, it had the monasteries, it had the, you know, the civilization, the Christian civilization in making, compared to what was over in Rome, that rabble, that almost to be, you know, destroyed kind of old kingdom, where Christianity was just one of a zillion of other religions fighting for some kind of special place for itself, and terribly embroiled in politics. But these people who really should have known better end up voting the other way. Well, there's no doubt that that would not have happened had the emperor not been sitting in that chair and essentially directing things, with a lot of help from Alexander and Athanasius, of course. Anyway, a lot of things happen in this 60 years or so, and we saw some of it. Arius is dead 50 years or so by the time we get to the Council of Constantinople. Athanasius has done his deed on Arianism, he thinks, and the whole apocrypha that in part have been feeding Arianism. But it still hasn't gone away. A couple of years after Nicaea, by the way, Constantine seems to realise that he's been misdirected, he's been badly advised. He'd been told by Alexander and Athanasius that if he just took a heavy hand with these Eastern bishops, brought them into line, everything had settled down in the East, Arianism would just die, the kingdom would be united, etc. And it's not the case. He's hardly back in Rome when he hears about this rebellion that's going on. The Eastern Church is totally cheesed off with what's happening, and people are already talking about breaking away. Now, he's towards the end of an 800-year empire, knowing it's starting to fail, desperately needs a religion, and hopefully this will be Christianity, to kind of provide a glue to hold the empire together. And he hears that in fact, rather than make it better, he's just made it worse. So he actually bans Athanasius from the empire. Athanasius is out of a job. He's too smart to let that go on for long. He finds his way back. But Constantine has a big rethink, and it's quite significant that he starts to see, in a sense, the fracturing of the empire and indeed the fracturing of the church, and that he's probably contributed to it by taking too heavy a hand at Nicaea. By the time we come to this 60 years on, Rome is in even worse shape. People are thinking seriously about how smart they were to put all the eggs in the Rome basket. And it's a perfect opportunity for the East, or at least Constantinople, which is sort of East, sort of West, as it is today. You know, Turkey right in the middle of it all, sort of brokering between East and West. For Constantinople, for the East at least, to reassert itself a bit. So the Council of Constantinople is called, largely to challenge a lot of the Roman kind of dominance. And it actually employs Arian popularity, the persistent Arian Christology. It continues to bubble, now not just down in the Arab Christian world, which is getting further and further away from the action, but Arian Christology has actually taken more and more of a purchase in the East, more and more of a purchase in those parts that want to counter Rome. It becomes part of the definition of being anti-Roman that you're an Arian. So rather than kill it off, as Athanasius so desperately wanted to do, and Constantine sort of did formerly, it actually made Arianism more popular in a wider sector of Christianity. And its bit of politics is to actually establish Constantinople as the second most important centre after Rome. And indeed, if it hadn't been in the end, the action of a number of Roman bishops who came in quite late in the piece of Constantinople, knowing they were about to be done in, and swinging a vote the other way, Constantinople might well have been declared by the Council of Constantinople as the new, prime centre of Christianity. Then comes the Council of Ephesus, which kind of swings things back the other way. It's a further disenfranchisement of the East. It condemns Nestorian attempts at compromise. Nestorianism was a serious attempt, as there were many coming particularly out of the East, to try and find the middle ground between the Nicene formula that they were far from convinced of and their own sort of, if you like, broadly Arian kinds of dispositions. But, again, rather than deal openly in a theological way with the issue, the Roman inclination was to just try and impose, to suppress. And so predictably, Ephesus's little contribution to the politics of the day was to actually, and probably the real reason the whole thing was called, was to actually give some of the growing Greco-Roman church that was centred on an eastern port, on an eastern site, on an eastern sea, namely Antioch, one of the oldest centres of Christianity, to grant it independence. And so a whole lot of what should have been really an Eastern Christianity is made directly accountable to Rome rather than its closest see. All stuff that's really irritating to the East. And then comes Chalcedon, where finally there is the first major split. That was our friend Pope Shenouda's Coptic Egyptian church. This time it condemns Eutychianism, and there's a big debate, that goes on to today about whether Chalcedon just condemned Eutychianism, which was a particular species of an Arian Eastern Christology, or all of monophysitism. Monophysitism being, in a sense, the final Eastern attempt at compromise. Monophysitism meaning Christ had one nature, not two, as Nicaea had seemed to suggest, that there's these two natures, divine and human, that are kind of coterminous through the whole event. The real problem that the East had with that notion was it made Jesus' human life sound a bit plastic. It made it sound like he was just another one of those many, pagan gods who had come in human form at some stage but weren't really human. The whole Arian thrust had been Jesus has to be human. We have to be left with the prophet. We have to be left with the person that we can follow. Surely that's what it's all about. You lose that in Christianity, haven't you lost the lot? Well, as far as the Easterners were concerned, that's what Nicaea had done. It had done in the real Jesus and replaced him with a kind of a pagan-like pretend human who's really a god, and declared a duophysitism to get themselves around that concept. How can you be God and man? Well, you have two natures. For these people, that fundamental Arian position, but no, God issued forth his own Son as an expression of himself, who lived a full human life, and then went back to the Father and took his place at the right hand, as a God, if you like. But what we're left with is the real Jesus. That made a lot more sense. It was a lot more pure Christianity. But, of course, it wasn't the Jesus that the empire needed. And Chalcedon endorses Rome as the centre of Christianity. It's a real victory for the East, for the Westerners, and for Rome. Constantinople II grudgingly accepts, and then I put here, full stop. That's it. Alexandria and Antioch, gone. Off the map. And at that point, the Alexandrians, the Copts, they say, okay, we've had enough with all your games. We know we're the real Christians. You go and play your imperial games and we'll have our own church. Thanks very much. First major split, and wasn't just them, quite a few. Tensions persist. Won't go through it all at this point. We'll come back to this 600-year era. The big split happens then finally in 1054, the end of any pretense of unity, the Great Schism. There's a whole lot of events around this that you can read up on if you wish. The high point of this moment, this big moment in Christianity, is when the two bishops of the two vying centres of Christianity, Rome for the west, Constantinople for the east, the popes of those two places, patriarchs, call them what you like, Leo the IX and Michael Cerularius, they declare each other's churches to be heretical. They excommunicate each other, tit for tat, and just to, kind of rub salt into the wound, they do the typical really mature thing, and they say, right, you over there in the west, I don't want to get it wrong here. They ban Greek and Latin respectively. Latin's for the west. Greek by this stage, interestingly, I'll talk a bit more about this. Greece, that was initially part of the Western Church, has now become part of the Eastern Church, and there's another story for that. But these are the two dominant languages on the two halves of Christianity. And so the Easterners, they say, right, can't even sputter Latin anymore. You're a true Eastern Christian. And the others do the same with Greek. And everything that goes with that, not meant to read their books, say any of their prayers, sing any of their hymns, all of that stuff. Okay, now, this is sort of when you get the little squiggly thing happening on the screen, going to a slightly different era here. And you're going to get sick of me talking about this because I can't make sense of all of it without continual reference to what's happening in and around Islam. I suppose for me it's sort of like, you know, that picture or photo or whatever it is, you know, the young girl and the old woman. And you look at it and you can sort of see the young girl, and someone says, see the old woman? Can't for the life of me. No, see that? You know, there's her glasses. No, no. Oh, yeah, right. And then from there on, of course, every time you look at it, all you can see is the old woman. It's a bit like that for me with the whole Islam thing. You know, not only does that very disenfranchised form of Christianity and probably a whole lot of displaced Jews spawn fairly quickly, really, after Chalcedon. It's only another century or so. And you've actually got these Christians who are looking for their Messiah to come back, you know, probably to prove that they were right all along and whip that silly Roman church, and now the East, you know, don't want to know most of them anyway. And you've got the displaced Jews down there, you know, looking for their Messiah to come for the first time and take them back and rebuild Solomon's temple. And they're all in there and they're mingling around with other Arabic traditions, and somehow out of that comes this, what for a lot of them, particularly the Christians I think, as displaced Arabic Christians, looking somehow or other all the way back to where it all began with Abraham and whatever happened to the Jesus they knew and revere and all those wonderful books that used to, and it's all been disposed of by the Western Church. I can see how quite easily that sort of community with those sorts of beliefs would have come to see Islam as truly the fulfilment of the Abrahamic traditions, particularly for the fact that Islam would have seemed to them to have a much, much better sense of who Jesus was than most of what they would have seen happening over in the rest of Christianity. And so, you know, I just can't help but see that connection. As I say, there is a very interesting scholarship going on around those sorts of things. But leaving even that sort of more quaint connection aside, there's just a whole lot of things that influence this East-West thing that involve and implicate Islam. Islam rises reasonably quickly. You know, by the 700s at least, it's a substantial force across North Africa, and most of what would have been the Arab Christian establishment becomes Islamic, including Jerusalem, of course. You know, we know those Christians were in Mecca. That's one of the alleged centres of where it all starts. And all of a sudden they're in Jerusalem. They've got all of the important sites wrapped up, the Muslims. And very, very quickly, by the 700s, they're in Spain. They're actually moving into the Greco-Roman world. And when you stand at the tip of Morocco and look across on a fine day and see the southern coast of Spain, you can see how easily it would have happened. We have this series of events that starts in 1095, very soon after the East-West split. That's all about supposedly freeing the Holy Land. These Christian crusades go on for a couple of centuries. They become part of the institutionalism of Christendom to free the Holy Land in the first place, and particularly Jerusalem, free the Holy Land from these terrible Muslim pagan people. They don't know anything about who Muslims are. And then that sort of translates a bit later on into the Reconquista by Ferdinand and Isabella to free southern Spain, 1481 to 1492. Christopher Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Same guy who sends Christopher Columbus out to, you know, find the new world and take the wonders of Spanish Christendom to those terrible places and people, decides he better clean up his own backyard and sends his army down south to rid those awful Muslim establishments where they have all these hospitals and schools and running water, and they look after each other, and oh my God, you know, what do they think? We've got to bring the civilization of Christendom to those poor people, and we've got to free those Christians. This was all part of this thing too, you know, the Holy Land. For the first time in centuries, all of a sudden, Rome, if you like, the Western establishment, is saying it cares about the Christians who are down there. They're captives of Islam. I've got to save them. Same sort of stuff here. Down in southern Spain, there's poor Christians who just want to be free. In fact, they're freer than any Christians in the whole world at the time. They've got the best universities, they're translating works, they've got the best scholarship going in the whole of Christendom. They've got to be freed. The Crusades are pretty dodgy events in every respect, including militarily, and not surprisingly. You've got armies thousands of miles from their home on other people's home turf. To come from, Scotland, as some of them did, down into the desert. Just the climate, the everything would have been a nightmare. And, of course, the Muslims fight back. I mean, they have to, actually, Islam's interesting because it settles down after a bit of intertribal rivalry. It settles down to being a pretty peace-loving kind of a place for at least a couple of centuries in North Africa and in Spain. And so the Crusades comes as a hell of a shock. All of a sudden, here's these, guys looking like Heath Ledger in Knight's Tale, coming over the hill with their spears and their lances and their bows and arrows, just wanting to destroy. They don't even want to talk about it. They just want to destroy. And, initially it's a shock, but then eventually, of course, they fight back. And they're not bad fighters. And indeed, Saladin, of course, of legend, is the great general of the whole event on either side. Saladin is not only the great warrior who finally got Orlando Bloom to lead the Crusaders out of Jerusalem in whatever that movie was, but he's also a very, very admirable character. And both sides, both testimonies testify to that. He's actually the one decent leader, decent person in the whole event. Very just, very fair, but very determined. Nur al-Din, also a pretty good leader of people, but interestingly for us, a bit of a theologian as well. And Nur al-Din is the one who first uses the word jihad, which is, an important disposition in Islam. It means intent, will, the disposition to follow the Abrahamic law, to follow the 5 pillars, to, fast and tithe and all of those sorts of things. Nur al-Din, the counter-crusader, is the first one who uses the word jihad to mean holy war. And fascinatingly, he does it in the context of the Christians. First time in any literature we find the word jihad used as holy war, it's attached to the word Christian, the adjective Christian. And what Nur al-Din is saying, he uses beautiful Abrahamic theology to do it. Basically, you Muslims, you're the fulfilment of the covenant, and that's great, but you're asleep at the wheel. You have these wonderful civilisations and you care for each other and all the rest of it, but you let these Christians who are a lesser breed than you get the jump on you. And why? Because they're prepared to fight for their faith. And that's what you've got to do too. So from here on, you've got to copy that Christian jihad, that Christian will to fight and die for your faith. And in many ways, it's the letting out of the genie out of the bottle of what would develop over the centuries into what we now call Islamic terrorism or Islamism. But the interesting, real hard connection with the East-West thing is that the Fourth Crusade, about 100 years on, and they haven't been terribly successful. This is the one that initially is going to go down through Egypt and take Jerusalem from the back, but for some reason or other, no one knows exactly why, they decided to go through Constantinople. maybe to gather more Christians for an army, who knows? But whatever the motive was, they got to Constantinople and they let loose. And they did at least as much damage to Constantinople, which by that stage they probably saw as the enemy. It's a century and a half on from the split. They did as much damage there as they ever did down in the so-called Holy Land. And that is something that sits so deeply in the minds of an Eastern Christian who knows their history. I have a friend who is a Ukrainian Orthodox, and I've been to weddings and baptisms and funerals, and of course typically of an Eastern Orthodox service you've got to give away the whole weekend to be at it. But I was at, I think it was a baptism of one of his kids down at the Ukrainian Orthodox Church in Sydney, and it was just after John Paul II had become the Pope, and I had foolishly sort of thought maybe that would be a good bridge with the Eastern Church, a sort of an Eastern European. Anyway, I forget how the conversation started. But in the course of the conversation, this all came out. This big burly Ukrainian bloke in what was then the 20th century knew all about this. He knew about it enough to get his blood pressure up. For him, the Pope represented what had come and slaughtered his own people way back then, his own Eastern Christians. And I can remember, wishing I hadn't even entered on the conversation, as this guy said to me something along the lines of, "He is a Paul, he is the Pope. I would not trust him as far as I could spit out of my mouth," he said. Okay, well, let's talk about the cricket. Western and Eastern Christianity at war. It got as sad as that. Okay, so with all that background, and as I say, just sort of focusing on theological differences without some sense of all of that makes it all just seem pretty stupid, frankly. What the heck is the problem? Is the problem theological at all? Or is theology just the kind of semi-respectable front for separating people who have such a sad history? But on the surface of it, these are the sticking points. For at least 1,000 years, and in many ways for a lot more than that, the whole thing centres on this word, filioque, Latin for "and from the Son." And so, and it's all about the Holy Spirit, third person of the Blessed Trinity, who Nicaea would suggest emanates from the Father and the Son, because the Son is equal with the Father. Jesus is absolutely and utterly really God, and let's not fiddle with that. So the Holy Spirit emanates from the Son. But of course, that's not Arianism. And so the Easterners will want to continue to say, no, the Son emanated, if you like, from the Father. The Son was born from the Father, and so the Holy Spirit can't then be born or emanate from the combination of the two. Now, you can really believe that this is awfully important to Jesus, can't you? This is why he came, to sort of, make sure that we went for millennia debating one word. Christians who are supposed to be united, but try and tell either side that in the heat of the moment. So, on the surface of it, it's all about Christological differences around, guess what? Nicaea. Like I say, when we get into our plastic pants, we're going to have to go back and have a damn good look at Nicaea, because it is a scandalously divisive moment in Christianity. And pneumatological differences about the Trinity, and I've just put that up there to make myself sound really smart. Pneumatology It's actually not a distinctively Christian form of theology. It's applied loosely in primal theologies. If theology means study of gods, literally, pneumatology means study of spirits, pneumos, Greek for spirit. But any Christian theologian worth their salt will want to remind you very quickly that the difference between Christian pneumatology and pneumatology in general is the capital P. Because we're not talking about any old spirits here, we're talking about the Holy Spirit, third person of the Blessed Trinity. And so on the basis of this, of course, the West accuses the East of Arianism and therefore heresy, won't accept filioque, got to be an Arian, heretic, here we go again. And beautifully the East comes back and accuses the West of paganism, which is another form of heresy. Why? Because they've turned Jesus into one of those pagan gods like Mithras or whatever. So nothing really that wasn't, there 700-800 years earlier. There's nothing terribly new. It just gets worse and worse, and in a sense, sillier and sillier. But what it was really all about, I think, was, and again, another nice big word, ecclesiology, theology of the church, and that one is more distinctively Christian, particularly about the role of the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, and the relative positioning of Rome versus Constantinople. And there's all sorts of floppy disks not talking to each other here, because the way the Romans seem to take Constantinople's challenges was as though Constantinople was wanting to take over Rome. The way I read it, Constantinople was never really wanting to take over Rome. Constantinople was quite happy in a way to be the centre of Eastern Christianity. They understood the East and let Rome be Rome. A bit like, if you know anything about the American Civil War, the North and the South. Again, floppy disks not talking to each other. The South happy just to have a confederation of states and a loose alliance that could form a sort of United States, where Richmond could be, in a sense, the capital of the South, and Washington, sure, they can be the capital of the North. Wasn't what Washington wanted, wasn't what Lincoln wanted. Lincoln wanted Washington to be the capital of all of it. You had to be a United States. And states' rights had to be subjugated. It's a bit like that, as I read it. Constantinople, the Easterners, happy to have East and West in a loose coalition, recognising each other's differences. Rome, because the old Roman mentality, the old imperial mentality, they've just got to have it all imposed. There's only one way, Lex Romana, and that's all there is to it. And of course, I just want you to note that Alexandria at this stage is so far buried by this stage. Whatever Christianity is left down there that hasn't been Islamified is just doing its own thing very happily and pretty much got nothing to do with any of this. And that's the lost Christianity, of course, that Jenkins talks about. So let's just have a look at these ecclesiologies, these theologies of church. This is where we look at the people. Bit of an obsession here with A's. They didn't get far past the first letter of the alphabet. Just to break it up a bit. We'll have a quick look at them as well. Now, we've sort of looked at Arius and Athanasius and Alexander. I want to go back now and look at Aquinas, at Augustine, and just work through. Okay, so there he is, born sort of, a couple of decades after Nicaea, and all the way through, some of those rough moments, and almost lives to see Ephesus, not quite so much Chalcedon, but his spirit was well and truly hovering over those later councils. he is the guy for the first millennium. There's no doubt about that. Be quite frank and say it's probably not one of my personal favourite characters, but I say that even more to just underline what a clever man he was. He was the one who could put words around almost anything, gild any lily, make kind of corporal punishment sound wonderful. He just had a knack. Very, very clever man. He could make really the most ogreish kinds of schemes sound romantic. Very, very clever. And he did the bidding beautifully of the Roman Church and what it was looking for at the time. And he does that best in his City of God theology and his theology of conscience. Just to put some fabric around that, I just want to deal very quickly with a bit of the Greek philosophy that feeds into it. And that's when we look at the peas. They had a bit of a thing for peas. Pythagoras, your old hypotenuse friend from geometry, was a mathematician, but he was really, in behind his mathematics lay a theology of thoughts and a cosmology. He was one of the first Greeks to really give us, I sort of mentioned this briefly a few weeks ago, to give us the sense of a dualistic world, you know, the two realms, the divine realm and what would eventually be called the senses realm. This inhabited by the gods, this by us, and never the twain shall meet. In the divine realm is all the good stuff. Surety, immortality, truth, justice, you know, whatever. Reliability. The senses realm, all the opposite. This mortal coil that we can't really rely on. There's no truth here. There's no true goodness. There's nothing that really matters. So how do we bridge the gap? How do we get of the divine oil flowing through to the senses realm? For Pythagoras, that meant having to find godly kinds of activities to do, fill our minds with godly sorts of things. And that's where mathematics came in. For him, mathematics was so perfect. It was a godly activity. And so he actually found sort of religious communities, monastery type places. They were called the Pythagoreans. And they, instead of sitting around meditating and saying the rosary, they did mathematics. They talked to each other about mathematics, and they purified their minds, and they became in their own mind rather godly. And what came out of Pythagoreanism was an effective kind of pyramidic structure where certain, you know, well-heeled, well-educated, wealthy people sort of, you know, were right at the top. These were the ones who did all the mathematics and were closest to the gods. And there were those who did a bit of mathematics and those who did a bit less. And then eventually you came down to, you know, those down the bottom who had no education and couldn't do anything. And that actually did, surprisingly, influence a lot of the thinking and the social structures, not just the thinking, the social structures of the Greek city-states. So that's Pythagoras. About 50 years on, comes along Protagoras. He's one of the sophists. Mike mentioned Heraclitus. There were others, Anaxagoras. They reacted to this notion of there being a stratified society, tried to wake people up to how they were being conned, particularly if they were down here somewhere. And so Protagoras talks a lot about each of you being a measure of your own truth. Man is the measure of all things, was his famous dictum. Think for yourselves. You know, there's no, I mean, he was careful how he said this because Anaxagoras got executed for saying there's no God. He just sort of said, look, if there's gods up there, good luck to them. They don't have much impact here. This is the only world we know. Let's live in it. Let's enjoy it. Let's work our way through it. And as for there being some upper caste, as Pythagoras wanted to suggest, no. So, you know, society is just flat. You know, being in the middle means power. Being out here means none. So what you've all got to do is try and work your way in here, and the way to do that is through rhetoric, which he will teach you for a price. Forming arguments, getting your thoughts straight, putting your arguments well, convincing other people that your idea was a good idea. That way you would have power. You know, no one's any better than you inherently. Really popular message. Protagoras, for a while, the darling of the crowds. Best, favourite after-dinner speaker in all of Athens. When he's telling these people here that, these bods up here are no better than them, not at all. Oh, good on you, Protagoras. We'll get him back next month. But then they hear that the next night he was off telling this mob here that, this mob here's no better than... And eventually the only friends he's got are the poor old foul of slaves. And so he gets run out of town and executed. Why? Because he was upsetting the establishment. Plato comes along. His teacher, Socrates, was a kind of a sophist at the tail end of the sophist period. And he gets caught up in this, what seemed to be a rebellion against the state. Socrates gets executed as being a threat to the morals of our young people. Got to get rid of him. This absolutely shatters Plato, who thinks that Socrates is the best thing since sliced bread. And he sort of then swings and becomes a real right-winger, a reactionary. And he calls on Pythagoras to do it. And all of a sudden, it's not, people up here doing mathematics, it's the wise ruler. He writes this thing in his Republic about a utopia where there is a wise ruler who is the one who is in touch with the gods. And if we do everything the wise ruler tells us, and this mob down here, the philosopher kings, they're the ones that have the job of telling everyone, the philosophers of whom, well, Plato just happened to be one of them. It's funny how these guys never create schemes that put themselves down the bottom. And then we've got the merchants and the middle class and the warriors and whatever here in the middle. And down here we've got all these serfs to do the hard yakka for nothing. Great society as long as you're up here somewhere. The Romans come along, all their ambitions of, Caesars and taking over the world, and they look at this and they say, wacko the didio, this bloke has written it for us. And so the wise rulers all of a sudden, Caesar, sorry, can't write up that high, Caesar, the philosopher kings, the Senate, the merchants are the great military warriors, etc., and the serfs are all of these slaves that they keep on making all around the world as they take over the world. Perfect model for a dictatorship. Perfect model for taking over the world. Okay, fast forward to Augustine. You've seen the situation. The Roman Church trying to re-establish itself as dominant. Christianity trying to establish itself as the glue in the empire. Trying to be, the imperial, universal religion, etc., etc., etc. What does Augustine do in his City of God Theology, 384? Takes Plato's Utopia and translates it, just plaster casts it over onto the church. No longer Caesar, it's the Pope. No longer the philosophers, it's the bishops. No longer the middle class, it's the clergy. And guess who's down here at the bottom? All the laity. His job is to just do what they're told. Perfect model. And he does it perfectly. Beautiful. Like I say, Augustine's one of these guys, you could put your thumb in the screw and you'd be screaming and he'd be telling you, this is good. This is good for you. This is great. This is what God wants. This is what God wants for the church. You better believe it. And Rome's the only place to live. Get over to Constantinople and all those crazy, Arab Christians down there with all their heresies. No way. They'll lead you to perdition. This is the place. And there is no salvation outside of it. He makes that very clear. It's the Barker Peter. There is no salvation outside the church. And that's very relevant to his theology of conscience. Because what Augustine then says is, there is only one legitimate form of Christian conscience. And it's not what we'd think conscience is. It's not like you know, feeling good, feeling right, you know, kind of getting alignment between your actions and your thoughts and your dispositions. No way. He says very bluntly at one point, if you have to choose between dying in good conscience, meaning, oh, I feel good about myself, I feel good about what I've done with my life, but being out of kilter with what the church, the Pope, wants of you, or dying in bad conscience, thinking, I probably shouldn't have gone down there and killed all those Muslims. I mean, it wasn't a very nice thing to do. But having done what the church wants you to do, there is no choice. You want salvation, you go with the church. Doesn't matter how you feel about it. Why? Because your feelings, it's just all this crappy stuff down here you can't rely on. That's not where truth is. That's not where reliability. It's up here. God knows best, and the Pope will tell you what God wants of you. Beautiful scheme for dictatorship, and it will be used mercilessly through the centuries. It's being used mercilessly today by Assad over in Syria. It's all around us. Augustine, Plato, all around us. I hope I don't seem like I don't like these people. Okay. Aristotle, poor old Aristotle, he's Plato's pupil who tries to get hold of a lot of this nonsense and kind of tame it a bit, be true to some of the good stuff that's there, but, you know, get rid of what would seem to have been Plato's head spin, you know, after Socrates' death. He does go a little bit troppo, there's no question about it. Aristotle's the man of moderation. He's the one who tempers moderation in all things. Find the middle path. But he's right out for the count. I mean, Rome's not interested in, the Roman Empire wasn't interested in moderation, and by the 400s, the Roman Church isn't interested in moderation. They just want control. Okay, look, you can read about this yourself. He's an interesting guy, Justinian. I just put it in there as one of the guys who could have bridged the gap because he was born out in the East. He had a whole lot of Eastern disposition. At one point in time, later in his life, he's married to an out-and-out monophysitist, Theodora, who he adores, and he seems to see things from the Eastern point of view. But he blows his chance to reconcile, and he goes down as a saint in the Eastern Orthodox Church, much maligned in the West and much maligned in the old Arab Church as well, which is interesting. Gregory the Great, he's the Pope who could have done it. He's sort of more, in a sense, Eastern trained. He's in that monastic tradition, and he becomes a Pope. How nice to have a Pope who's sort of got some scholarship, got some monkishness about him. But, you know, like happens, they get into a seat of power and they get all these people around them controlling them. And he ends up restoring the power of Rome largely through the depth of his own personality. But he ends up condemning all the Eastern stuff, and essentially his real legacy is setting things up for a couple of centuries' time when Charlemagne will kind of represent the Holy Roman Empire. Yeah, look, I'll do this one quickly and then we'll just have a quick little break. Anselm, very interesting. He comes right at the end of that first millennium. He's born a couple of decades before the big split. So, you know, it's a bit hard to say he had huge influence directly, but ultimately he does. I mean, there were plenty of chances to reconcile in those first 100 years or so, and there were lots of people there trying to make it happen. Someone like Anselm, in some ways, unwittingly, probably made it worse. He is the epitome of the Western Roman type of theologian. He's described as the first true systematic theologian. He was, as such, a really, really clever Christologist or Christologian. And in a sense, he was the one finally, centuries later, who put some of the intellectual kind of worth behind those Nicene and Chalcedonian formulas that no one else... I mean, all of the intellectual capital was in the East, it seems, until Anselm comes along, and he's so committed to the Roman cause, he takes on the English king to, he's an absolute papist. And of course he's horrified by the Eastern split and thinks they're terrible. So it just seems to shoot him as hard as he could be shot into this kind of schema, this way of thinking about Christianity. Nothing in the East can match Anselm's intellectual apparatus, his systematic theology. And it seems like around about this time, the East gives up anyway. It's too late. If there had been an Anselm to talk with, Eutyches or one of these characters, or better still Arius, who knows what might have happened. But that didn't happen, and by now the East is so deeply suspicious of what the West's on about that it's too late. He's famous for his ontological argument for the existence of God. Ontology being typically all this kind of stuff. All knowledge comes from on high. He is an absolute and utter unapologetic Platonist, Augustinian. It's a very curious argument. God is that than which no greater can be thought or thought of. God is that than which no greater can be thought of. Right, okay. All right so far. It's greater to exist than to not exist. All right, okay, it's greater to exist than not. Yeah, okay. God, why didn't I think of that? I mean, don't spend too much time. By all means, have a look at it later on. It's a curious... Well, the only point is it is sheer ontology. And as indeed the point of Anselm being brought into this debate is that the East takes one look and says, Gnosticism, told you, the whole West's heretical. Good, now we know. Goodbye West, off we go and we'll be the real Christians. So Anselm kind of does. He's one of those characters that he just sort of epitomises everything that 1,000 years of Western Christianity has created. And it's exactly what the East doesn't want, and now they know it. Okay, just have a little look here at, before I introduce you to my friend, yeah, yep. Okay, just quickly back to this. I mean, to oversimplify horribly. So Plato says it's all up there. That's where the really real is in the divine realm. Protagoras says it's all down here. It's all you got to worry about. This is the world you're living in. Trust your senses. Don't be suspicious of your senses. Trust your senses. Trust your observations. Trust your experiences. You can see how anti-scientific a schema like that would be if you can't trust your observations, your experiments, your experiences, your perceptions. You certainly can't do anything scientific. Protagoras, sort of puts a very early sort of scientific spin on the notion of reality and ourselves in it, and it's a much more sort of optimistic view of being a human being, for sure. What Aristotle does is sort of come along and say, well, it's kind of both. There are certain eternal truths. There are certain things that are beyond human experience. It's not all just in what you can see and touch and taste. But we certainly do have to trust what we can see and touch and taste. We do have to trust our observations, our experiences, etc. So he's the typical kind of moderator. And it's interesting that, as I say, even that was too much for the Romans who wanted a Roman Empire. because they didn't want people down here, at least of all, indeed, at any point below themselves, trusting too much about their observations and sense of what's right and wrong, and because otherwise these slaves might start to think they shouldn't be slaves, for God's sake, So, don't trust those feelings. It's a nice thing to be able to say. And of course, the church, the Roman church back there, it didn't want the laity, thinking things. I mean, that's, oh God, all these Gnostics, we got rid of that, didn't we, sort of, until we produced Ansel. So Aristotle is the moderator. And he's the one who gets pushed in this history further and further and further down into the Arabic world, where, together with the Apocrypha, Aristotle persists. Aristotle becomes a really important part of Islamic culture and Islamic scholarship. It's because the Arabs, the Muslims, knew Aristotle that they could go on and do all those amazing things in the Middle Ages in North Africa and Spain, like begin what we call modern medicine and modern science, and revolutionise the world. Why they could construct running water and have street lights, as well as have a social welfare scheme and ways in which their social fabric would accept, tolerate, even cherish minority groups like Christians and Jews, and allow them to do their scholarship, allow them to do their translations. Why? Because they mattered. In an Aristotelian scheme of things, people matter. Justice can't just be a concept, it has to be lived out in reality. But this is something that at the time, Christendom, the majority of it, is totally lost. And that's where this guy comes in. And he is, for the second millennium, sort of what Augustine is for the first. Most unfairly, really, I've got to say, Aquinas is often written off as a Roman Catholic theologian. I mean, so is Augustine sometimes, good Catholic theologian. Meant nothing for a start for either of them, because it wasn't Catholic and Protestant. Augustine actually becomes, as we'll see in the next lecture, Augustine becomes the darling of most of the Protestant reformers. They use Augustine to fight against Rome, irony of ironies. And they reject Aquinas because they also, most of the Protestants are trying to set up these sorts of churches, except local churches. Henry VIII, in setting up the Church of England, he didn't want, the slaves and the peasants having their own opinion any more than the Pope of Rome did. So they all use Augustine, mercilessly, as I say, right down to the present day. So Augustine's not really well described as a Catholic theologian. It's a nonsense. And really neither is Aquinas. I mean, he was sort of trapped in that identity for a lot of centuries. It's a sign that he's shed that identity, that in fact, astrophysicists are freely debating his teleologies. Okay. I've got to be careful here because I could spend a lot of time on this. If Augustine's a man for his times, I'd suggest Aquinas was way ahead of them, and it made it very difficult for him. As I say in that little thing that you read, I mean, what he produced, he doesn't make it to 50 years. What he produces, in a sense you couldn't fit inside this room, and he does it all with a quill, and he does it all himself, apparently. So to think it and write it all, I mean, it's just extraordinary. You wonder whether he did sleep at all. His extraordinary, prodigious kind of mind that is leaping ahead of the world in which he's functioning, and that's always pretty tough, especially, probably not so tough for Athanasius and Augustine. They were very much men of the world, they knew how to manage. But Aquinas really is more a monkish, scholarly type. He's not a good politician, and so he suffers a lot, and he dies very young. He really is the bridge between the old and the new, and he's the one who prepares Christianity for a scientific world by not rediscovering Aristotle, but in a sense by discovering Islam and secondarily rediscovering Aristotle. It's the Muslim scholarship that brings Aristotle back into Christianity, largely through Aquinas' work, heavily through Aquinas' work. And also for a more global and multi-faith era. The work that Aquinas does in dealing with the issues of the world, and here 800 years later, the best scientists the world can produce are still debating his stuff. And for a multi-faith era, no one was thinking that at the time. Even East and Western Christians weren't talking, much less Christians and Muslims, Christians and Jews. Not in the West, at least. So he revives in the West Aristotelianism, and I just put Eco in there as, I don't know if you've ever read Umberto Eco's The Name of the Rose. Not seen the movie with hairy-chested old Sean Connery, but that was a terrible movie, one of the worst adaptations of a book ever known. But it is a wonderful book. It's a wonderful book. Briefly, there's this monastery and all these monks keep on getting poisoned or whatever, and Sean Connery goes in as the detective to find out what's going on. And in the end, what is going on, it's the old librarian, I think it is, who's bumping them all off because they are discovering in a part of the library they're not supposed to go to, the works of, as described by Eco, the philosopher and the theologian. The philosopher being Aristotle, the theologian being Aquinas. That's how threatening all of this was. I mean, Eco captures it beautifully in obviously a bit of fiction, but it truly was. I mean, Aquinas, some years after his death, comes so close to being excommunicated and down with Arius and all of that. It's all just a bit much for a church, unless they can tame Aquinas. If he had lived longer, I think the rest of his life would have been pretty miserable, frankly, and I actually have a sense that he probably knew that. Death was probably, blessed relief. And why Aristotelianism? Why such a threat? Because of all of this. Because it has an inbuilt philosophy around thinking for yourself, trusting your own judgment, trusting your own perceptions, not just accepting blindly what you're told to do. And that's just not where the church wants to be, or a lot of it. Amazing in some ways that even parts of Aquinas were incorporated. And I think really because he is just such a mind that the church, struggling at the time to come to terms with the likes of science, the collapse of the empire, the new nation states, all of the demands, the Reformation. It's just had the East pull away. There's rumblings within the Western church leading up to the Reformation. It has to find someone who can lead it intellectually through that, and that's where Aquinas comes in. But it's a very selective picking and choosing of which bits of Aquinas get incorporated or not. He's the one, better than anyone in 1,000 years, who actually does reach out to Eastern Christianity in a work that he would never have named, and everyone agrees on that, called Contra Grekos, against the Greeks. It's not against anyone. It shouldn't have been Greek anyway. If whoever named it had known their history, they'd have known that the things that Aquinas is dealing with are all Arabic. It should have been Contra Arabos, if anything, but it just shows where the mind of the people who took this work and kind of skewed it were. But what Contra Grekos really was about was the most sensitive analysis of the Eastern Christologies that had caused so much trouble, and the most serious attempt to find that middle ground in pure Aristotelian terms, that beautiful middle ground between East and West, between the Nicene Chalcedonian type formulas and Arianism and Eutychianism and all of those. And it truly is. It is a most respect. It's not against. It's dealing with them seriously, teasing them out, looking at their benefits, looking at their strengths, dealing with them respectfully, and then, putting the Western view on it as well. A beautiful balancing act that just gets used and read, the last bit of it, as Aquinas proving those Easterners are wrong. This is all happening after his death. He reaches out to Jewish scholarship. Nobody did that. He uses the work of Maimonides and Abul-Afia. Maimonides, perhaps the greatest of all the Jewish philosophers of all time. Abul-Afia, arguably the greatest Jewish mystic of all time, the architect of Jewish Kabbalah. No one's doing any of this sort of work. And this is all in the middle of writing the Summa Theologica, for God's sake, which you wouldn't fit on a whole library shelf. He reaches out to Islamic scholarship. He uses Al-Ghazali, the Islamic mystic, Averroes and Farabi, the kind of medical people, scientists, the physicians, he pulls all of them in. Every bit of scholarship. He's the most amazingly interdisciplinary scholar. So he pulls right away from this old ontological mode that Augustine had left the church with and starts to deal with some of the realities that we're dealing with in the senses realm, some of the people. Let's not be frightened of these people. Let's learn from them. He's remember where he is. He's sort of round about the end of the Crusades period. He must have been bleeding, seeing what a mess Christianity had made of itself. And he's trying intellectually to get theologies in place that can help the church to deal with all of these things. To pull Christianity together in the first place, to pull the Abrahamic religions together. It's extraordinary work. For the times, it's absolutely staggering kind of work. Now, there's a glossy versus a bleak view of all of this. As I suggest, there are people, lots of them, who've taken the bits of Aquinas that suit and just ignored all the rest. Largely, the Western church took the bits that suited it, and the rest, thankfully, survived. The bleak view is that all of these were designed to castigate, criticise, reject, be it the Eastern Christians, be it the Jews, be it the Muslims. And just as you can do with any text, you can pull out a little piece that suits, that seems to suggest that that's what the whole text is about. There are parts in Aquinas where he can be described, if you believe just that little phrase, that he is, for instance, anti-Semitic. It's something that was commonly said by his critics, that he was anti-Semitic. You can see bits where he seems to be anti-Muslim. You can see bits where he seems to be anti-Eastern. I would suggest they're only bits. They don't fit with the whole at all, and they are the bits that it has suited a very prejudiced form of Christianity to promote and to use Aquinas' good name to somehow promote. Okay, just looking at a couple of his most significant works. This teleological argument for the existence of God. He draws on Aristotle, Averroes and Maimonides, really to counter Anselm's ontology, counter Anselm's Gnosticism. Again, Anselm could only work off this scheme of thought because only, the mind that's given over to God could possibly work out an ontological argument for God's existence. Aquinas is prepared to look at the world as we know it, the senses realm, and say, isn't that interesting? For every effect there seems to be a cause. The world is made up of a series of causes and effects, but there must be some cause that wasn't itself caused, surely. It's all kind of observational stuff. It's looking at the world around us, how things hold together. Well, so what is that first cause? What is it? Except some sort of a God, some sort of a supreme force. That's the argument. and a similar set of arguments around motion, etc. Prime movers, etc. It's all in the tradition It's all stuff that these characters have used across the traditions. He draws on it and he kind of develops it into the kind of sophisticated, semi-scientific premises that can still be seen to be relevant, you know, almost a millennium later. Synderesis, it's an anti-Platonist, it's an anti-Augustinian kind of a notion of what goodness, truth, if you like, is, ethics, morality. It can't just be something Gnostic. It can't just be something that belongs to some purified mind. Knowledge of any sort, including knowledge of the good, has to involve doing the good. And he draws again on Aristotle, Abulafia and Ghazali, especially the Muslim Sufi. A lot of his work is about knowledge. The only knowledge that's worth having is knowledge that does good. There are too many, particularly religious people, he says of his own Muslim people, there are too many people who think, like Plato, that all you've got to do is know the good. You know, it's purifying the mind. It's not purifying the mind that makes you good, it's purifying your actions, it's what you do. Sensus fidelium is really a counter to Augustine's very trapped, churchified conscience. Again, I mean, how could Augustine not think that conscience meant, you know, somehow doing what the church told you? But again, Thomas is an Aristotelian. He believes in the senses realm. He believes that we can trust our own sense of what's right and wrong. As long as we have an informed conscience, we can trust that it will lead us in the right direction. And indeed, he goes on to say in one of the bits that you won't find, you know, probably up on the church notice board on a Sunday, that in the notion of sensus fidelium, the kind of common conscience of the faithful, that there is no surer meter of what is good and right and pleasing to God than a core of conscientious God followers, be they Christian or Abrahamic followers or whatever, agreeing on what is good. And if it comes, he counters Augustine beautifully, if it comes to trusting in that, or trusting in what, you know, a pope might tell you, or whoever, any sort of authority figure might tell you, trust your conscience. Particularly a core of informed, conscientious believers, that is the most reliable meter that we have, even if that means countering what the authority of the church might have to say at a given point in time. It's quite radical stuff, and indeed could have been used very effectively to stop the Protestant Reformation from ever being needed had the church kind of caught onto it, really caught onto it. And in the notion of double effect and virtue ethics, again, he relies on a range of people, including Aristotle and most of the characters across the traditions, to work out practical ways in which ethics can function. How can we know what's good, you know, when we live in a world of, you know, a matrix of things happening around us? You know, can we just say it's wrong to steal? And that's it, in any circumstance. Well, it'd be nice if we could. But what about in the circumstance where, you know, somebody's dying and the only way to save them is to go and steal something that you can't get legitimately? And especially if you're living in an unjust state that's not providing that stuff through some welfare scheme. So what is the good in that circumstance? What's the right? Principle of double effect says that, you know, there will often be, out of one action, more than one effect. There could be multiple effects. And somehow you've got to balance those up. You've got to do a kind of a cost-benefit, risk-benefit analysis. What are the circumstances? What are the consequences? What would be the alternatives? You know, the way doctors have to make decisions, life and death decisions every day. They can't just say it's wrong to kill, You know, never turn that machine off. These days, the machine would keep people going for 1,000 years. They've got to make real decisions. Turning machines off, is that killing or is that letting someone go? All of these sorts of things. A lot of real ethics happens on a knife's edge. And Aquinas says we can trust. If you can't trust your senses, you can't trust your judgment about these things. You're sitting around waiting for God to, tell you. Well, you're not going to do anything. Aquinas says you can trust your judgments. You can and you must. It's God-given. God has given you, through his theology of natural law that again he takes from Aristotle, God has given you the capacity to do it. God's law is written into you. You have the power to do it, to make these difficult life and death decisions. You can and you must. It's your Christian duty to. So, all of that rests on the notion of virtue, developing in oneself, sort of a bit linked to the notion of informed conscience, developing in yourself the kinds of virtues that allow you to make good decisions in these difficult circumstances. So he really does open up a whole new world. He prepares not just Christianity, but the world, really, for the times in which, they're going to confront these sorts of decisions. They're going to confront the realities of multi-faithism. They're going to confront the realities of global ethics and universalism. And they're going to confront the realities of science that will push any religious beliefs, any theologies to the margins unless those theologies are seen to be dealing with those realities. Just a little postscript. He has some sort of breakdown. People debate what it was, but for the last almost 2 years of his life, he doesn't do much at all. And, some people say he just had a total breakdown, probably exhausted from all the work he'd done. But he does make this interesting comment that's recorded quite late in the piece, that he sees all that he's written now as straw, not worth anything. Is he really saying it was worthless? I mean, that just seems impossible. Or is he frightened in a way of the consequences of what he's opened up? He's feeling less and less comfortable in the church as he's known it. There's little doubt about that. You can almost see that the challenges for the church that he's known and loved and worked for so long probably are going to be greater than it's going to be able to cope with. He's a very, very interesting character. He's another one I'm looking forward to having a chat with one of these days. I don't call him a Catholic theologian or Protestant or anything. He's the authentic Christian. And indeed, when you look at the sort of work he did and the traditions that he tapped into, I think probably better than anyone I could point to through the 2,000 years of Christianity, he understood the role of Christianity as part of the Abrahamic faiths and sort of knew that Christianity couldn't move on until it understood itself as part of the fabric of Judaism, Christianity and Islam. Okay, any questions?
What does the Catholic Church think of Thomas Aquinas now? Like, is he sort of current in Catholic thinking?
I remember someone saying to me a long time ago that it won't be until the church, meaning the Catholic Church in this context, lets go of Aquinas that the world will discover him. And I think that's true. I think for hundreds and hundreds of years he was just so associated with, propping up particularly the Roman establishment. The Protestants all seemed to hate him. Everybody hated him, unless you're... But then the Roman Church moved on from Aquinas. Some would say went back to Augustine. There'd be probably some good evidence of that. And somehow they've let go of Aquinas, and now Aquinas is being discovered. You'll find Aquinas often on a list of, just in philosophy courses somewhere, you know, Introduction to the Great Thinkers of the World. It's interesting now. You just Google it, see how often he'll pop up, Oxford, wherever, as one of the characters who just has to be dealt with, say, in a 12-week course. You can't understand what's happened without Aquinas. That wouldn't have happened, I'd reckon, even 25 years ago. Okay, well, speaking of theology and all that stuff, have a happy Easter or Shabbat or whichever way you do it. Thanks very much. See you on the 17th.